Or just the audio?
We'll just go for it here. Hey guys. Yeah, thanks a lot, everybody. We've got a bit of a mixed crowd at the moment. We've got a couple of folks online. We're streaming this via Zoom to our YouTube channel. And then we've got a couple of us in here in the room in Wellington. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. Yeah, after a pretty interesting year, we're really happy to present a few success stories from folks that have come fresh off the ice, or in some cases their instruments and their science was completed. So we're really interested to hear from everybody today. But yeah, just to kick it off, really, we'll go to the North Pole and we'll go to the Arctic. So we'll start with Rusha, who's in Otago at the moment, but is researching up here at the Antarctic Research Center at Victoria University. So without further ado, we'll kick it off with Rusha and go from there. Thanks, everybody.
Want to share the lower screen?
This one here. Bear with us a moment. We're just setting up our screen share.
Cool. Okay.
Can everyone see Rushla's first slide?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So I'm gonna be telling you it's gonna be mostly really nice pictures about my trip to the Arctic last year. And you may have heard I went to this Mosaic Expedition, which was an expedition with a plan to freeze an icebreaker into the ice for 1 year and into the Arctic Ocean, and take measurements over the whole year while with exchanging scientists. So the project itself aims at a better understanding of the Arctic climate system and its representation in global climate models, because many processes in the Arctic climate systems are poorly represented in climate models because we don't really understand them sufficiently. But as long as we don't understand these processes, Arctic climate projections will not be robust.
Excuse me, guys, sorry.
Yeah?
The audio is quite poor. We've got ours all the way up. Don't know if we could get a little closer to the mic or.
Okay, is it better now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me better now?
That's the one. Thank you so much.
Okay, cool. Considering the large changes in the ice, we really want to know how the Arctic is evolving and how will this affect climate in other parts of the Earth. So on this slide, what you can see on the right-hand side is some really nice surface ore that I took the picture of in the Arctic. And then on the left side is the kind of the idea behind Mosaic. And it was to look at the Arctic system as a whole system. So not just me going or us looking at sea ice, but there was a whole team of ocean scientists, ecosystem scientists, biogeochemistry, atmosphere, and of course remote sensing. And we made all these measurements at the same time to try to see what processes, how these processes interact. Yeah, sorry, I'm just grabbing the. I'm just trying to change that. So why snow? So I'm interested in the snow, and because snow is a key component in the Arctic sea ice system and plays a crucial role for sea ice prediction because it can influence the thermal conductivity, so the thermal properties of the sea ice. It influences the albedo and it influences satellite retrievals of the ice. So on the left-hand side, you can see an image where you can see sea ice in the Arctic with melt ponds in summer, snow in winter. And snow, because snow, as you may know, snow is a really good insulator. So depending how much snow you have and what the microstructure of that snow is, it could prevent growth, or it could slow the growth of the sea ice. At the same time, snow is really white, so it reflects most of the shortwave radiation and therefore influences the energy budget. Also, snow is quite important. Okay, sorry, I'm not sure why this is doing it. So snow is important for the energy, for the transmission of light into the ocean. So it does affect the ecology. And why do we want to know this? So we want to know this to inform satellite retrievals of sea ice. And why do we need satellite retrievals? Because we need to know what's happening to the sea ice. Also, the uncertainties in the temperatures and what's going to happen to the Arctic are quite large. The uncertainties are large and the changes are really large. So as long as we don't understand what's happening to the whole system, we won't really know what's going to happen to the Arctic. So the Mosaic Expedition, as you may know, we were supposed to change scientists every couple of months. And then March last year came, COVID-19 came, and everything got a little bit delayed. So I ended up on the last leg leaving Wellington in July before quarantining in Germany before going to end up on this ship. In the background, you can see the flow we were working at. And so the idea was for the Polarstern to be in the sea ice for a year. However, the Polarstern melted out, floated quite far south with the sea ice and melted out. So we went and found a new flow. And that's the new flow that we were working on. You can see all sorts of different instruments in the background. This is summer, and you can see a lot of meltons. This is the cruise track of Mosaic. So it started in red in October 2019, drifted a little bit north and then south. So those are the different lakes of Mosaic. I was on the last one, on the purple one. So as you can see, it drifted really far down the Fram Straits, ended up out of the ice between Greenland and Svalbard. And then that's where I'll show you in the next picture, where we met the Polarstern. We were with a different ship, and then we went all the way up north to kind of where the expedition spent quite a little bit of time with the idea to catch the freeze-up processes of the autumn freeze-up processes of the sea ice. So what did we do? So I was interested in the snow. I did this slide for some outreach, but I think it shows quite well what we do in snow science, also what we as snow scientists do. And you may see the stuff that I'm walking on looks like snow, but it's actually not snow. It's called the surface scattering layer, and it's sea ice that's melting. And you can see there's a whole bunch of measurements, different measurements that we were taking. We were trying to do quantitative measurements. In the top, that figure on the top right, you can see a colleague of mine kind of taking temperature and density and all these hand measurements that you can take. You can see on the bottom right where we have taken a lot of samples for other groups. And some of those are black carbon samples, ice nucleated particles. Oh, voice is changing. Water isotopes and organic compounds. So we've collected those. In the top left, you can see fresh snow scan of a micro CT measurement. So a big part of our project was to look at microstructure of snow on the surface scattering layer, and I'll show you some scans soon. This next slide, I think it shows really good. In the background, you can see some remote sensing instruments. You can see the ship, and you can see this slide with all these different snow measurements we were doing. And now to come to some, I'm just going to show you some really interesting pictures. So I was telling you about the surface scattering layer that looks like snow. And if you look at not sure if you can see my mouse, but this would be the surface scattering layer, and on top would be snow. This is a side view, and this is the top view. So you can see surface scattering layer, essentially melted sea ice on this figure from the top. And this top image is a near infrared image at 940 actually nanometer of the surface, where you can see if you just use visible wavelengths, everything is white, but if you use different wavelengths in the near infrared spectrum, then you can actually see differences in different snow structures. And so while this to the bare eye, it looks like snow, I had to convince myself quite a bit the first time I saw this, that it's not snow, but if you look at the microstructure of it, it really is not snow. And you can imagine like stuff like this has really big influences on albedo as well as on satellite retrievals, just because of the changes in the microstructure. We've recorded some really fast changes in the snow. So this is on the left, we see this is fresh snow, so maybe not quite as fresh snow that you're expecting. So here in the middle, you can see the surface scattering layer at the bottom. We have fresh snow in the morning, and this is a picture of that fresh snow in the morning, and this is a picture of the fresh snow in the evening. And what I wanted to show you is how fast snow changes. So in the morning, everything was really small. The microstructure of everything was quite small. But then in the evening, you've already built up this crust, which has really, which can really influence your albedo or your satellite retrievals or your thermal conductivity. The next picture is probably one of my favorite pictures, where we've just looked at different surface deposition, so what we call surface hoar, and these were quite large, and this was in within 3 days. This was different scans. So this is the surface, and you can see that depending on the atmospheric conditions, you get different types of surface hoar that then again have different signatures with satellites or different albedo and different, and they will affect the snow structure later in the year differently. Not sure if you can see my mouse, but the image on the right is just frosted surface hoar from this date. So it was just a day later with quite a different, different surface area and physical properties. This is another favorite. We were able to scan some platelet ice, which is essentially happens if you have super cold water. We know platelet ice from Antarctica, but platelet ice in the Arctic has not been observed that much. And it was really nice that we had a micro CT on board, and we were actually able to scan these platelet ice bits in situ. And on the, sorry, there's a typo in there. And on the right, you can see the bottom of the ice. So this is from an ice core, and this is upside down. So what you can see on the right is the bottom of the ice. And I was told with some other people, they were calling it skeletal layer. But Pat Langhorne actually said that it's probably just incorporated platelet ice into the bottom. The next one is we looked inside the ice. And so there are different processes. So there's the salt, freeze up, and decay that you see on this slide. On the left here, so the gray stuff is, channels, I think. No, there's a de-ice. It's the sea ice, and you can see the channels going up and down. I think the gray is the channels. There's salt. How do you call them? Salt channels. And then here it's actually snow on top of the sea ice, and it's really interesting that and in red is the salt. That the salt that's in the sea ice can actually make its way into the snow above the sea ice. On this figure here that it's melted, obviously we can see the melting of the sea ice. On top, you can see a little bit of snow, and the rest is really like these melted through salt channels. On the right, we can see freezing in ponds and leads, and how the freezing is not just straightforward freezing, but it has bubbles, and it has areas of clear ice. And then up here in the pond freezing, you can see at some point you'll even start having the salt channels, but when they first start, they're just mainly bubbles. And then this slide, I wanted to show where we collaborated with people, because it's not just, again, the idea was not just for us to go and take our measurements, but it was to actually collaborate with people. So on the bottom right, this is eco-scientists being really interested in what's happening at the bottom of the ice, because a lot of the creatures live in the bottom of the ice. Here you can see a drone that's measuring spectral albedo, and we were trying to coordinate lots of our measurements with other teams, in this particular instance with the drone team. Up here with atmospheric measurements, with biogeochemistry measurements, with the transect with remote sensing instruments, just to actually check how in situ, how does snow affect certain remote sensing instruments, and then with other teams such as the ocean team as well. So that was really fun. And I'm just going to show you some other pictures. This is squid. The length is about that the biologists found. This is about maybe 5 centimeters in length, and there were some really beautiful creatures that we saw in the Arctic. And I did promise you some polar bears. This is a polar bear being very interested in one of the turbulent fluxus stations. And that station was quite a bit, like maybe 2.5 meters above the ice. So that polar bear was very playful and was checking everything out. At one point, the polar bear was trying to check it out a little bit more. This required, after the polar bear was gone, this required about 2 hours of fixing the slate, but nothing was broken. And this is, and this is the last picture of a polar bear mother and cub that came close to the station. And please let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks very much for that, Rusha. I'll just open it up to the floor here in Wellington, and if I could get some help from Natalie, if there's anything coming in online. Anyone in the crowd here have any questions for Rusha?
Oh, sorry, can you quickly wait? There's a helicopter outside. Okay. Okay, go.
Does the salt water coming up from the bottom really affect by the surface melting of the snow and sea ice?
Sorry, there was still the helicopter. Can you repeat the question again?
Does the salt water coming up from underneath really affect the melting of the surface sea ice and snow?
No. So the melt of the sea ice and snow, from the top is mainly affected by the surface energy balance. I don't think the salt water is really, and because by the end by the time that the ice starts melting, the sea ice is actually really fresh because all the brine has actually drained out from it. So I don't think that has, but I think it does have the salt that's in the snow will then eventually drain out. And I think that has, that might affect, maybe Greg can tell you about it, that might affect certain remote sensing retrievals and properties, depending on what we have. But I haven't really looked into that in detail.
One question. How sharp is the boundary between the snow and the sea ice?
Got a question here from Fred Davies asking, how sharp is the boundary between the snow and the sea ice?
It's, as you may have seen, I think the boundary between, so what I've shown you is the snow on sea ice that has been melted, and that boundary can be quite blurred, but the boundary of snow on sea ice that's on first year sea ice that has not been melted, I think it's a little bit sharper. I haven't looked at those images yet, but if you think of the snow of the sea ice that has been melted, kind of has all these big structures and then has new snow blowing and filling up these structures, then that's quite blurred. But if you think of like a frozen pond that then has, or a frozen lake that then has snow on top, I think that boundary is a little bit more less blurred and a little bit sharper. Does that make sense?
Awesome. Well, it seems like nothing coming in from online, so might be off the hook there, Ursula. We really appreciate it. Thanks for bringing us a Northern Hemisphere perspective. And yeah, now I'm just pleased to welcome Giacomo Giorli onto the stage here in Wellington, and we'll broadcast out to you back in Otago and everywhere else. Giacomo is with NIWA, and he listens to the ocean, so we'll be interested to hear what he's got for us.
I hope the sounds work. We're good.
Can everybody see and hear? Get a thumbs up somewhere, somebody?
You have a pointer or something? No.
This will work.
Oh, yeah,
and that'll work.
That's
for them as
great.
well.
Thank you, Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Jamie, for inviting me here. I'm gonna give a talk that probably you don't see that many of this, but we have a program at NIWA that is funded by NB that is gonna try to assess how the MPA, the Marine Protected Area in the Ross Sea, is actually valuable in protecting the ecosystem. And so as part of this program, we're working with underwater acoustics to monitor the underwater environment, and especially for top predators like seals and marine mammals. But we quickly realized that there's a lot of sound sources, especially when you're under the ice. And so we have plans on trying to understand how maybe climate change, or no, I should probably remove the maybe, how climate change would affect the sonic environment in the Arctic, because as soon as you remove the ice, the ocean will sound different. And that would totally affect the ecosystem and the communication of many species probably. So the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area is fantastic, I think, because it's like the largest marine protected area in the world right now. It was a big deal. So there's 25 countries involved into this. And it was established in 2017. And it covers like 1.55 million square kilometers of sea. It's massive. And it's divided into this different kind of zone, GPZ. It's a Cree research area, a general protection zone, and the special research zone. But in general, the important thing is like, this is one of the most pristine ocean environment in the world. there's almost no human activity except for toothfish fisheries. And so, as I was saying, we have this 5 years research program that is going to complete next year, but we're trying to extend it for another 5 years. And we have many objectives, but the baseline is like, we want to characterize what's the ecosystem like right now in the Ross Sea. And we want to try to apply methods to measure any change in the long term that we can observe. And obviously, we want to create some modeling approach that we can evaluate, so that we can evaluate if the MPA, long-term MPA, is effective or not. But part of this program, it's about understanding the top predators in the ecosystem, as I was saying. And so we're trying to understand the occurrence of cetaceans using acoustics. And it's also like an opportunity to study the soundscape, as I was saying. Now, the term soundscape comes from land. It's like people started understanding what's the effect on humans, for example, living in a city where we have traffic, we have trains, we have, if you live in Chicago by the metro, it's like your walls are shaking, that kind of things. But then it's been extended to natural environments. What happens if you remove a sonic component from an environment? It doesn't sound anymore the way that it sounds. And so that has an effect on the perception of the environment, on the people, but also on the animals that use the environment. So I found this definition, which is an ISO definition of soundscape. Is an acoustic environment is the combination of the acoustic sources, the natural and artificial sources in a given area. And also these sources are modified by the environment itself, because the sounds transmit to the environment, and the way the sounds transmit on land in a forest is different than the way that it transmits in the ocean. So the environment itself creates the soundscape. Obviously, we use sounds for doing this job because sound is not an electromagnetic radiation. So in air, no problem, we can see very far. But as soon as you stick something underwater, visibility is very poor. But sound is a pressure wave, so it's a compressional wave and transmits very well in water, especially because water is a higher density than air. And this is something that animals have evolved to use. It's like if you're underwater and you live in a place where there's no light after 300 meters of depth, how do you perceive your environment? How do you communicate in an environment that is completely dark? And it's like, you have to cope with it. And this animal evolved the ability to use sounds to do that. So we are kind of like tapping into their vocal activity. And to do that, we use like some recorders that we can deploy at the bottom of the ocean. And this is kind of like standard precision in oceanography to make moorings with instruments. And the basic idea is that we dump in the ocean like a weight with cables and some acoustic releases and an instrument and some buoyancy devices that keeps everything vertical. And then when you release it, it's just going to pop to the surface and we get it back. And this is an example of the recorder. This pictures on the right here is an example of the model that we use. This little yellow things is where the sensor is for the hydrophones. In this research program, we have 3 listening stations in 3 very different places. We have one that we're gonna call A1, which is close to Iceland Bank, and this place is covered in ice 9 months, 10 months out of the year, and it's a totally different environment from, for example, A3, which is close to the Pacific Antarctic ridge, where it's barely covered in ice during the year, and we'll see the difference. So this is an example of how we deployed this year our second deployment And this is a footage from Tangaroa that just came back in February. So this is an example of the recovery in which the floats just come back up and it gets recovered. And when we actually deploy it, we deploy it the floats first, and then we deploy it at last the weight. And then when we release the weight, everything sinks down. And now they're releasing it, and it just gonna sinks down. So ambient noise in the Ross Sea. I'm just gonna give you example of the two different places. For example, A1 and A3 that we were talking before. Remember, A1 is it's close to the continental shelf, Iceland Bank. A3 is at the Antarctic Pacific Ridge. And these are power spectral densities. So here we have, it's gonna take me a while to explain you this, especially if you're not an acoustician, but here we have sounds level power as a function of frequency on the x-axis. Now this is logarithmic, semi-logarithmic, but the different colors are different percentile. So it means that, for example, the red line is the fifth exceedance percentiles. It means that only 5% of the energy is above that line generally during the year. And so, and the dashed line are what are called the Wentz curves. The Wentz curves are kind of like a point of reference in ocean noise. It's an interval of power as a function of frequency that in which usually you have different kind of noise in the ocean. So shipping is on the lower side of the spectrum, and then wind is a little bit higher, and there's some variability. So the take-home message in these two graphs here is that A3, all the measurements of the noise at A3, they fall within the variability of the natural ocean. But when you look at A1, the low frequency spectrum especially is very noisy. So we have a lot of energy in the lower frequency there. So there's the two different sonic environment just naturally. And we can see it here. This is the same, but it's in a time scale. So now it's a spectrogram kind of representation. The color coding is the power. So red, it's more energy. Blue is less energy, and is a function of the month and frequency on the y-axis. So at A1, there's a lot of noise in the lower frequency throughout the year, which is what we were seeing in the general power spectral density before. A3, that doesn't happen except for a little bit in January. And then there's a lot of this kind of like banded noise, which around 20 years, these are whale choruses. So when the whales come and start singing, there's reverberation in the environment. And so it's kind of like the average noise in that band increase, and you see it as a band of noise here. And then in A1, for example, these are seals. It's kind of like banded seals. We'll get to that later. But when you look into the noise a little bit in detail, for example, if you start separating decadal bands and averaging the decadal band noise as a function of hour, for example, you see that there's no trend. So this noise that we see at A1, so we have A1 in blue and A3 in red here, it's not a function of the day. So it doesn't happen rhythmically during the day. But if you look at the average sounds in the decadal band between 10 and 100 hertz as a function of tide, then we see that we have this kind of variation. And so we have higher level of high tide generally and lower level of low tide. And I believe that that's because when the tide comes in, it kind of exerts some pressure on the sea ice at A1 and makes some kind of vibration that affects the noise in the band. That this doesn't appear to happen at A3 where there's no ice. Also, we have a general trend of having quieter soundscape in the low frequency as a function of sea ice. So the red line here, it's the percentage of sea ice cover taken from satellite, I think, from the University of Hamburg. And you see the A3, there's very low ice, but whenever the ice comes in, it's generally quieter, the band, and the same as A1. So the ice has a huge effect on the sonic environment of this region. And then we have another component of the sounds in the Ross Sea, which comes from the animal. And Jamie asked me to please let you hear what the animal sounds like. And these are all like spectrographic representation of the signals. And what we have is it's an FFT of representation of the sound of its frequency as a function of time. Same color coding. Red is more powerful. Blue, it's less powerful. And you see that, for example, this is sperm whales on the top, and you have this very sharp broadband clicks. There are probably like a seconds apart, and they sound like a metronome pretty much. It's very long, I'll stop it. It's boring, huh? It's kind of like hypnotic, but this is sound sperm whales makes to detect prey in the deep sea. And odontocetes without dolphins, and in this case are killer whales, I think. They use the same approach of echolocation to find targets, mainly prey in the deep ocean, but they do it at higher frequency and higher rates. And so the sound's more like higher frequency, higher rates. It's a different kind of signal, but to our ears, it's similar. And what else we have? We have fin whales that pass through, and fin whales that make this very low frequency sounds around 20 hertz. So it's a very long. In water, 20 hertz, it's a wavelength of 75 meters. So it's a huge sound generator, but they're not audible usually. So I tricked it. I sped it up a little bit so that we can actually hear it. But the sounds almost like this. Yeah. And then we have the craziest, I mean, to me, I don't study seals. I just, I have colleagues that they're gonna do this job, but I wonder if Steven Spielberg's got his sounds from the seals. They're so random. I know you will make them. Yeah. So anyway, the seals are crazy, I think. So yeah, I mean, in the future, we're trying to, we're in the process of publishing some papers about the temporal trends of when this animal comes into the area. And as I was saying, it would be very interesting to understand in the long term how the change in sea ice cover associated with climate change will actually would affect the soundscape of the area. And obviously, you know, we're looking for international collaborator because we're collecting so much data that that it's physically impossible to actually, and financially impossible almost to look at everything for an organization like us. Just from the last trip, we have 21 terabytes of recordings at 3 locations, and it's a lot. Yeah, it's a lot. So yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge people that work on the project, especially like the technicians and the people that deploy the instruments, because they're really, really, really skilled professional that they work with high technology things, and it's not easy to work in that environment. So this is a list of the people that make that possible. I'll take any question if you guys have it. Yeah, you first.
So the 2 locations that you talked about, it sounds to me like that they could be like the RC one, the marine, the ridge one over the Tasman, could be a proxy for what happens when the ice thins in other places. Like, because you're looking at different locations, you'd be able to kind of predict what it would sound like. Or is there something else that might be going on as well?
Yeah, there might be. I mean, the source of ambient noise in the ocean that don't just come from the ocean. Wind is a big source of sounds. So as soon as you get into the higher latitudes from Antarctica, you get into very, very, very windy places. And I'm not sure how much a place that would be on the other side of the continent, but on the same latitude, if we would have the same climate regime, than that. So, but it's definitely something that it's an interesting point. I don't know if I answered your question. It's hard to make prediction without knowing what's the climate variability associated with the place.
Do you have any problem with certified training?
Well, we might, but that would be mainly affecting the whales, like the large whales, like the fin whales, because usually they vocalize in the sulfur channel, but in the polar region, the sound split profile is pretty constant, because there's not a lot of variation in the temperature throughout the water column like you have in tropical region. So the thermocline is not that strong.
What's your relationship?
Oh, we're collaborating with Curtin University actually right now, because they have they work with the Antarctic, the Australian Antarctic Division also. So we're trying to extend and to put together data sets to get a better story about how fin whales might utilize the whole continent and how they might migrate to northern latitudes for, I think, breeding. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Do you have any evidence, or has anyone done any work on whether the thickness of the sea ice affects their success in hunting?
Their success?
In hunting, when they're using sonar to track down a prey rather than communicate with each other. Using the sea ice is reasonably flexible. That's not a good that.
I don't think that anybody has, but I'd like to get your point on why would you think that would be important?
Because you said that the difference in the way that sound is transmitted under the sea ice close to the shore and way out to sea where the sea ice might melt or it's a lot thicker, that's quite substantial.
Yeah. So I know what you. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. So the type of whales that they use sounds for foraging, they use the high frequency, short and broadband sounds, like the clicking sound. That kind of sound doesn't transmit that long. It's not a long range. It's not a very long range type of sensor system. There's no evidence the baleen whale can echo range or echolocate using that low frequency tonal sound. But dolphins, they're really good within 500 meters, maybe 800 meters. Sperm whales, definitely larger range, a kilometer. But that's kind of like the spatial scale that we're talking about when we talk about sensing the environment using sound for these animals. Yes.
Any way to tell how far away the whales were?
No, we don't. We don't. In this case, we don't, because we only use one sensor. So the main thing is, like, we could model. We could do some kind of like sound propagation modeling and trying to back calculate the ranges of a signal. But the big issues that we have is we don't know the sound sources of the animal. We knew it from a few species that have been in captivity, but not for the large whales. So that's a big unknown.
Did you pick up any through that little experiment? Did you pick up any sort of fluid sounds?
Oh, there's some boats, definitely the fishing boats, the two fishing boats coming. Yeah.
What's the ratio between sound?
Oh, there's not that much using. I haven't found that much human sounds there. Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm saying that to my, for the data analysis I've done so far, there's not that much human sounds compared to Cook Strait. No. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Jocko.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, so Jocko's also a really talented musician. So I'm hoping that at the next show we hear some soundscapes mixed into the compilations. Thanks for that. It's really fascinating. Let's see. I'll stop sharing here and give it back to you, Greg.
All right, we'll just get ourselves organized here and we'll be away. All right, kia ora koutou. Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear us all right. Just let me know if you can't. I'm Greg Leonard from the University of Otago, where I work in the National School of Surveying. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about some of the sea ice work that we get involved with down here at the University of Otago. Apologies if my voice gets a bit rough. I had an hour lecture and a 2-hour practical this afternoon where I probably did a little bit too much talking, but I'll certainly try to get through things. As Jamie mentioned, we're one of the groups where our people didn't go south last year due to the COVID disruptions, but very fortunately, some of our instruments did. The main one being what we call the Otago Sea Ice Mass Balance Station, and you should just be seeing a photograph at the moment of the happy Antarctica New Zealand team that installed this on our behalf. So just going to run you through some little bit of motivation and background, and then hopefully some pictures and videos and animations, if I can get my slides here to advance. So why are we interested in sea ice? And Ursula already covered some of this in her presentation. It is a relatively thin cap of ice sitting on the frozen cap of ice sitting on the ocean surface below it. Forms, of course, both in the Arctic and Antarctic regions. So we heard a little bit about it in the Arctic, and now we're going to talk a little bit more about it in the Antarctic. Is formed mostly due to heat loss from the ocean to the atmosphere, but a little bit later on, we'll tell you about some ice that forms when part of that heat flux goes from the ice into the ocean. It retreats in the summertime, but does not completely disappear, and more of it remains in the Arctic than the Antarctic, but that's certainly changing in the last little while. And it's often described as the Antarctic sea ice cycle in a season is the largest geophysical change on the planet. And these graphics just hopefully give you a little bit of an idea about the changes in the size of the sea ice cover between a winter period and a summer period. So again, some reasons why sea ice is important from a global perspective. And again, Richelle already touched on this nicely in her talk. It's a relatively bright surface. So when you have a sea ice cover over the ocean, much more of the incoming radiation is reflected back into the atmosphere, as opposed to much more of it getting absorbed into the surface of the ocean if it was covered by water. And the snow cover is even brighter, and it even enhances that effect even further. From an ocean standpoint, sea ice cover will contribute to ocean circulation, because when the sea ice cover forms in the winter, it rejects a lot of the brine from the structure, which goes in to the ocean surface. Of course, then it's relatively heavy and dense, so it drives a lot of those large circulation patterns. It's an important habitat for wildlife and releases nutrients into the ocean surface, again, in the melt season. And in terms of the Antarctic environment, it can protect some of the ice shelves around the continent where it forms in front of those ice shelves, making them less vulnerable to wave-induced, perhaps iceberg calving, because the sea ice can attenuate some of that wave energy. So just a few figures again to set the scenes and some of the the latest trends of sea ice, both in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. So on the left-hand side of the slide, we're looking at the northern hemisphere. The top panels are the respective winters, and the bottom are the respective summers. And I guess the thing to really draw your attention to is the parts that I've circled here, is that we're seeing negative trends in the Arctic, both in the winter season and in the summer season, but it's a little bit more pronounced, quite a bit more pronounced in the summer season. Where we're seeing different trends in the Antarctic, both the winter and the summer, we're seeing a slight positive trend over the satellite record, but there's quite a bit more variability in the summer season versus the winter season. And the first half of the past decade, we were seeing some relative kind of increases in sea ice concentration in the summer, and that's reversed a little bit in the latter half of the decade. If you're like me and you're kind of a spatial person, I like to think about maps when we're talking about sea ice concentration. So these are products from the National Snow Ice Data Center in Colorado in the United States. On the far left, we're looking at sea ice concentration trends in the winter months. So this is February, and next to that is in the summer. And what I take away from looking at those two figures is that if you can see my mouse and I get it in the right place, we see in the summertime that these negative concentration trends are going right through the central Arctic, where if you look at almost all the other figures in the wintertime in the Arctic and in the winter and summer in the Antarctic, we're seeing more of these trends around the fringes, whereas the Arctic, we're seeing that summer trend very strongly through the central part. I'm going to oversimplify things a little bit for this talk, but you can kind of break ice into, or I'm going to try to break it into two categories. Sea ice, we're going to talk briefly about pack ice, and then a little bit more about land-fast ice. So in terms of pack ice, this is mobile sea ice. It can be driven around by ocean currents and wind forcing. It's made up of ice pieces that we call floes, which vary in size, and these can be pushed together, and they can either be frozen or unfrozen, depending upon perhaps where you are in that pack ice field. This is opposed to land-fast sea ice. It's fast not because it's quick, it's fast because it's attached either to a coastline or an ice shelf edge, so it's very much stationary. It's generally comprised of large flat sections of ice, but you can get some open leads and some ridges forming in that sea ice. In the photograph in the bottom right is the one that I took from a couple years ago. This is the land-fast sea ice in McMurdo Sound, and you're seeing some evidence of some ridges in the background. So when you do get some pressure when the ice is forming, you can see some ridging events. I kind of borrowed this tagline from a colleague of mine, Pat Langhorn. We refer to McMurdo Sound as the place where ice from the land meets the ice in the ocean. And it's really kind of a natural laboratory for us who are interested in studying sea ice and sea ice that's influenced by ice shelves. Of course, it's right next door to Scott Base, so we get some good ready access to it. We've been doing this for quite a long time, and we've managed to do some winter science. We've been there in the dark, as you see in the upper right photograph, and we've been there in the sort of the summer seasons as well. So I'm going to just kick this animation off on the right-hand side, and what you should be seeing here is this is a zoom into the southwest part of the Ross Sea, really focusing on McMurdo Sound, which I'm kind of circling with my mouse at the moment, and this is Ross Island over here. And this is a visualization of a recently released data product that's showing us the fast ice sea ice cover. This is produced by Fraser et al., a group out of Australia. And what you're going to see here is when I kick this off is that every 2 weeks they produce a product that gives us an idea of where the fast ice edge is. Color-wise, the yellow, cyans, and reds are all indicating this fast ice, so this ice that's not moving around, and the light blues are the ice shelf. I'll just keep that kind of running in the background. It started in the early 2000s and runs all the way through 2018. So yeah, we've been studying this for 30 years. Again, it spans a couple of winter projects, which I'll say a little bit about, and one integral part of that is what we call our Sea Ice Mass Balance Station, or SIMS for short. And I'll show you some preliminary results from our deployment this last season. We've looked at a number of things over that time period, and a recent interest that's been around for quite a long time now is looking at the effects of ice shelves on the adjacent sea ice cover. Oops, we don't want to see that again. We want to go to the next slide. This is a fairly busy cartoon, but I do want to spend just a few moments talking you through this. There's a very particular type of sea ice that we see in sea ice adjacent to ice shelves, although Ursula showed us some photographs or some scans of this as well in the Arctic. This is this platelet ice, and this little cartoon attempts to describe why we see platelet ice adjacent to ice shelves. So what we're looking at is a section starting from ice sheets as they flow off the land surface and onto the ocean surface, and they come afloat. And then at the front of that, we often get sea ice forming. And this process that we're looking at is driven by warm or salty water getting into the ice shelf cavity, where it can come in contact with the base of the ice shelf, where it can melt and or dissolve that ice shelf. And this water that gets produced is known as ice shelf water. This is what this ISW stands for. And because it's relatively fresh water, it's buoyant, and it can flush out from underneath the ice shelf. And as it starts to rise through the water column and the pressure comes off from this, it changes the freezing point of this water, and it ends up to being what we call supercooled. And this is what Ursula mentioned as well. And in that supercooling, if you get nucleation sites, you can get growth of ice. And if that happens underneath the ice shelf, we can get deposits of what we term marine ice. If it gets flushed out from underneath the ice shelf and can collect underneath a thinner sea ice cover, this is where we might call this a sub-ice platelet layer. And if it gets incorporated into the growing ice cover, this is what we refer to as platelet ice or incorporated platelet ice. And again, a lot of sea ice is driven by a heat flux to the atmosphere, but the sub-ice platelet layer grows by heat rejection into that supercooled water in the ocean. And very approximately, where this arrow is pointing is roughly where we tend to put our sea ice mass balance station. So that's where it kind of fits into this cartoon. And this process varies both spatially in McMurdo Sound from west to east, and from how close or otherwise we are to the ice shelf front, and it varies seasonally as well. Now I'm just going to kick this video off as well and talk you through it. So this is some videos. The first one is going to be what you see if you're a GoPro camera that gets pushed down through a jiffy hole that gets drilled through the sea ice. As we push down through the ice and break down through, so you're looking at the water below, and this is what these platelet crystals look like as they start to extend down below the base of that sea ice cover. So they're really beautiful to look at, really sort of uneven surface that you see. They kind of grow in clumps, and they're really quite delicate as well. You only tend to see this type of growth really in that sort of proximity to an ice shelf. And we're going to switch over about halfway through, so we must be pretty close now. to some video that was shot by Natalie Robinson and Brett Grant from NIWA at a campsite that we were in, kind of the central McMurdo Sound in 2018, and a good excuse to show you some nice close-ups of Weddell seals as well. But if you're really focusing really closely, as you might have seen as the seal came up through the bottom of the hole, there was some of this platelet ice that it dislodged as it came through. This is just some fantastic video just showing you how really fragile and really beautiful these platelet crystals can be. They tend to form on anything that's, any ropes or anything that's suspended through the water column when you're getting this outflow of this ice shelf water. So not just in the sea ice cover, but anything really that's sticking out into the water. Just really quickly, another way that we can observe these platelet crystal structure is the standard way of taking some sea ice cores. So you see David Dempsey, who was a master's student a number of years ago, taking a sea ice core in McMurdo Sound. We take them back to the lab and we create thin sections of ice, melt them onto glass slides, thin them down with a microtome, put them under some cross-polarized light, and we get some idea of what the crystal structure tends to look like. So just as a couple of examples for you, the one on the left here is what we might expect closer to the top of the ice. So it formed earlier in the season, and this is what we call columnar ice, where a lot of that heat flux is going into the atmosphere. This is the long grain structure, crystal structure that we tend to associate with that process. The one on the right is what we tend to see when we see some of this platelet ice appearing in our sea ice core. So we've lost some of the nice, long, organized structure of the columnar ice, and it looks a bit more sort of higgly-piggly, I suppose, and that's an indication of those platelet ice crystals. So we can use this technique to quantify exactly when we saw the signature in our cores. I mentioned some overwinter work that we've done over the years. So two main projects. The first one way back in 2003, feels like a long time ago now. So this is a project led by Pat Langhorn and Tim Haskell. And I was a postdoc on this project, and we spent the winter down in McMurdo Sound. And one of our major findings was really confirming a significant amount of sea ice growth was due to that heat loss to the ocean. We were able to quantify that a little bit. This was followed up by another study in 2009, where they did a bit more work and confirmed really the presence of that ice shelf water beneath the sea ice through some of that crystallographic analysis that I was showing you before. And some of this animation on the top right just shows some of those platelet crystals growing really in situ when we had some oceanographic instrumentation in the water. So this is the SIMS. It's a part of our observation program. It's been a part of that for a number of years. Just in the last few years, we've kind of moved it more into that repeatable observational space. Before that, it was kind of tied to various events that were going on from season to season. But in the last little while, we've been able to get it down there in a repeat cycle. On the left-hand side, you're looking at just a schematic of what this sea ice mass balance station is all about. The main part of it is really just a thermistor string or a temperature probe that sticks through the ice cover and dangles down into the water. And the idea is to try to get this installed sometime in the winter months. So we're getting some of the thermistors frozen directly or immediately into the sea ice cover. And then we're able to track as that sea ice interface grows deeper into the water column by looking at those thermistors as they freeze in over time. We also have a snow sensor, so we can track the evolution of the snow cover over time. When available, we've made use of a University of Canterbury electromagnetic induction instrument, which allows us to start to tease out the difference between the solid sea ice structure and the sub-ice platelet layer that's underneath. But to date, we've just had one winter season where we've had the EM31 installed. And this just all gets fed into a Campbell Scientific data logger, which goes through radio telemetry back to Scott Base. And then we have just an FTP link. So once a day, we automatically download the data and we feed it through in near real time to a website, which I'll show you about in the next couple slides. This is just a plan that Sunil Ladd from Antarctica, New Zealand put together for us a number of years ago, just kind of laying that out. And these are just some photographs of the station over the years. So this is the box that the EM31 sits in when it's installed as part of the station. So what do we need to install the SIMs? Remember, we want to do this in the wintertime. So we're usually the first group that's really traveling out onto the sea ice cover in the wintertime. So if we look at this image here in the sort of the central part of the screen, this is a radar image of McMurdo Sound. So this is Ross Island here. This is the Hut Point Peninsula. So Scott Base is just over here in the US McMurdo Station, just about on the end of my mouse, just in here. And what we're looking for is the formation of a stable land-fast sea ice cover. So in this radar image, it's really the darker areas of this ice that we'd classify as land-fast. The ice shelf is this area down in here. And what we're actually looking at is an image from July last year, where we've got an active wind event, which has created or opened up the McMurdo Sound polynya. So we're seeing really lane mirror circulation in here. And this is something we watch for very carefully through the season as we're trying to find the right time to put this station out, because clearly we need a good solid ice cover. Our station doesn't float. So we need to get access onto the sea ice, and we need to have a nice stable environment to put that on. On the right-hand side, this is a slide that's sort of in preparation by our, a PhD student working with us, Maren Richter, who's looking at the data from these sea ice mass balance stations over the year, just to give you the idea of some of the areas where we've located these, all located very much on the eastern side of the Sound due to these logistical constraints that I was talking about before. I've hopefully covered all those points in the text as I was talking about that. A lot of work goes in early on in the season to really try to establish when and where we can install this station. So just to give you a little idea of that, I know it's a really busy slide, but we're looking at a series of Sentinel-1 radar imagery, starting from earlier in the season and going until later in the season. And this is from last year. And there's a lot going on, but what I really want to draw your attention to, if I can get the mouse to cooperate here. Again, this is Hut Point Peninsula. So this is Scott Base just in here. This is the Ross Ice Shelf and the McMurdo Ice Shelf. And there was this little crescent of ice that formed fairly early on in the season. And even though there were large wind events that happened all the way into July and August, we were keeping very much an eye of the land-fast cover just down in this area. And we saw that it was surviving through all of these events. Sometimes we'd get this extent going out a little bit further into the Sound, and then we get a bigger storm coming along, which would remove a bit of that fast ice in the middle of the Sound. But we could, looking at these images over time, we could gain confidence that this ice had been there for a good amount of time and would be a stable platform to work on. And what we found over the years of doing this work is that usually around about July and August, even if there's still strong wind events coming through, and we're looking at the moment on the right-hand side is just some of the Met data from Scott Base, looking at some of these southerly storms coming through the Sound. Usually by August, the land-fast sea ice cover has strengthened enough that it can resist any of those wind events that happen a little bit later on in the season. We put this information up on a website. We use it, of course, to do our planning for the SIMS station. And we also, when I get around to it, I update the Met data so we can make that link between what we're seeing at Scott Base and what we're seeing in the imagery. So typically, a typical season, the way this all works is we get the equipment shipped down to Scott Base, usually in February or March. When we have winter over events, our own scientists install the stations, but more typically, this is something that Antarctica New Zealand does on our behalf, and we work with them actively in that early season to find the right time and place to install the station. There's routine maintenance visits that are made throughout the season to replace batteries and download data cards as required. And then typically someone from the Otago group will come down, usually as part of another event, and they will remove the station and take sea ice cores away at the end. But because we weren't able to travel to Antarctica last year due to COVID, Antarctica New Zealand took on this role on our behalf and extracted the station and did all the coring work for us as well. And just last week, one of the fabric cores made its way here back to Otago. Just to finish up on, I'm probably already over time, apologies for that. So this is where we ended up installing the station in 2020. So again, we're looking at a radar image on the left-hand side from a little bit after, a few days after the station was installed. And then we're looking at a MODIS visible image here on the right-hand side, closer to when the station was extracted. So again, we did put the station in that sort of little crescent of ice that we'd noted from the beginning that was there from the early season. And just some real quick preliminary results. These are the kinds of outputs that you get from the sea ice mass balance station. So in the upper left, we're looking at a temperature contour plot of the sea ice. So the way you interpret this is at the very top of this. This is at the basically the top of the ice, or the ice-snow interface. And then we're looking at the temperature signal as we go deeper down into the ice. Down here at the very bottom, those thermistors are still in the water. So we can track how these thermistors freeze in over time, and we can get some information about the growth rate of the sea ice, as well as its temperature fluctuations going through that sea ice from the temperature profile. And this is just a preliminary output from our snow sensor, which is installed as part of the station. Again, we try to get this in sort of June, July, to try to capture as much of that growth of the winter as we can. But this season, due to COVID and other delays, we got a little bit of a shorter window, just about a month's worth. And just to mention a few works that are going on, Maren is again working up the history of the sea ice mass balance stations over the years. And this is just an example of plot of paper that she's working on. And we have a master student as well, who's really focusing in on the snow sensor and trying to improve and come up with some alternative techniques for measuring that snow surface at the site. Just to finish on, we've got support, which is great, from the Antarctic Science Platform over the next few years to keep supporting the installation of the sea ice mass balance station. Already have plans to put it again this year. So both the standard Otago station, and we've just got a new commercial sea ice mass balance station produced by a company in the United States. And this is the first time we're going to be able to put that next to our one and do a comparison throughout the wintertime. And there was a bit of a news story in November of last year, just due to that, again, that interest in the fact that there was more limited access to Antarctica. And so if you haven't seen it, and if you're interested, there's just a couple-minute piece put together on News Hub that has some nice footage from Jamie McCaw and others from Antarctica, New Zealand, showing their activities in the removal of the site. So yeah, thank you very much for that, and I hope I didn't go too far over time, and happy to take any questions you might have.
Oh, thanks so much for that, Greg. That was great. I bet there's a couple of really excited graduate students that have some data come streaming in now, so that's kind of fun. Yeah, thanks for that. I'll just open up the floor if anybody has any questions for Greg. Anybody online there? So, Greg, I did have a question. I think, I mean, this is one of the shining examples of, really unique collaboration, and, really points to the organization capacity, both of kind of your group and Antarctica, New Zealand. But just wondering if this, could provide any sort of template for us moving forward. I think you guys had a pretty long-standing relationship with them, obviously, with the some of the work you have Antarctica, New Zealand folks do over the intervening time. Yeah, just put it to you like that. If there's if you see there's any utility in expanding this a bit, yeah, just given that we're not really sure what the season holds for us in front of us.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you've hit on a real key point there. A real success to this program is working very closely and collaboratively with Antarctica, New Zealand, and building those relationships over time. It is not an easy thing to do, to go out onto the sea ice in the winter when it's dark and when it's cold, and you're often really the first group out there on the season. So you're proving routes. Where you do what we can here to help in terms of looking at the satellites and giving our interpretation of what we're seeing, but there's nothing like being there on the ground. And also, and just in terms of the permitting for this work, Antarctica New Zealand is really just recently has kind of brought that into their more of their monitoring space, and that really helps us going from year to year to be able to put this station in every year. So all those are really vital to its success. And yeah, the other thing I think this speaks to is winter science. It's something that gets talked about with interest, and I think with this program we've been able to demonstrate over a good number of years that with a right approach you can certainly do good winter science. And that's really important for us because a lot of the key things we're looking at is when the sea ice, of course, is growing in that winter time. So yeah, I like to think maybe this could be a little bit of a small prototype for really thinking in that winter science space.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Thanks for that, Greg. We've got a question here.
Can I just add something to that, Jamie, as well?
I think,
yeah. Greg, don't think you actually said that. Greg actually wintered over in 2003. And there was also a team that wintered over in 2009. I think we do get higher quality data when we have winter over scientists. So although the Scott-based team do great work, it's no substitute for actually having scientists actually there over winter who can dedicate their time to do it. So I think that's going to be the next thing, and that's one of the things we hope to talk to Ursula about.
Yeah.
Here is kind of that long-term plan of getting scientists back wintering over down there, because from the sea ice point of view, that's definitely when we get the most information and the best information. But yeah, with the Scott-based staff, they do amazing things.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. That kind of gets at my follow-up really would be, is there anything that worked better? You'd mentioned, pulling daily satellite images. I could understand that might be a challenge at Scott Base, but maybe not. Was there anything that worked better in that whole process versus everybody there in person?
Oh, I think, yeah, I mean, people who've been to Scott Base probably know about bandwidth issues, and I think being able to drive all of that from Scott Base would probably still be a little bit challenging from that regard. And that was one of the drivers for putting up this website, is to be able to put it in a way that they can get ready access to it. And so I think that works pretty well, from being able to kind of do all that work here and be able to share that with them and use it as a planning tool. So I think, yeah, we've had some reasonable success with that.
Awesome. Thanks for that. We've got a question from the crowd here. I'll just bring her up so you can hear her.
I don't think it's a very exciting question, but I'm just curious about the commercial venture. What on earth would be commercial about having a sea ice monitoring in Antarctica?
I might hand that over to Inga, who might be able to speak to that a bit more directly.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Inga Smith from the Physics Department, and the Physics Department owns the new and exciting Cryosphere Innovation Sea Ice Mass Balance Station buoy. So Dartmouth College is where Don Perovich has now moved. He used to be at Crowell, and so there used to be things called Crowell buoys, and he had a PhD student called Cameron Plank, and his PhD was to make these sea ice mass balance buoys. But because it's an engineering school, it was also, he formed a company to make them. And because of Mosaic that Ursula was on, there was a market for these. And so if you go to their website, there was a large number of those deployed during Mosaic. So there have been a couple deployed in Antarctica by Louise Biddle, who's now in Sweden. But yeah, it's fairly early days for deploying these in the Antarctic. They are designed for the Arctic. So they kind of float, but only because the Arctic sea ice has these melt events that Ursula talked about. And so you want your buoy to be able to redeploy. They're not really designed for the open ocean, but we're having those discussions. They cost 27,000 New Zealand dollars, and other groups regard them as disposable, but we don't regard ours as disposable.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Well, if there's no other questions, I think we'll bring this really special, fresh off the ice to a bit of a close. But I've just got two thank yous for the speakers. One, basically for making it happen. I mean, way to go, right? There's quite an effort there. So from Musha enduring multiple isolations in multiple places, and you know, to everyone kind of you know, giving their science up to have someone else do it for them. You know, I think it just really speaks to the team nature of kind of everything that we're doing. So just thanks for that, and yeah, just thanks for joining us today. Really special to the Antarctic Society to hold the Fresh Off the Ice set of talks every year. So really happy to have you on board, and happy for your kind of endurance for that. So, and then just, yeah, thanks everybody to, you know, folks in the crowd and folks online. Yeah, and we'll see you again next time. So that's us for now. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah.